the Group Chair of IRM Pakistan Group and your moderator for today's webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, more and more business entities are working towards establishing an ERM function in their organization, with the growing recognition of the value addition that structured risk management brings to the organization. The importance of structured risk management has all the more come to light during the pandemic. There were so many organizations that didn't have an ERM function, didn't have pandemic plan or business continuity plans, and had to suffer and struggle more to adjust to these unprecedented times. Having said that, those organizations that have been through the process of establishing an ERM function know that this does not come without any challenges. And this is the topic of today's webinar. We shall be looking at the challenges that we have to encounter while establishing an ERM function, how these challenges can be overcome. So if you are somebody who is new to risk profession or has been entrusted with the task of establishing an ERM function in your organization, many of the questions will be answered in this webinar. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists for today. So I have with us Mr. Rahat Latif, Board Member, IRM UK and Chair of Interest Groups Committee. Rahat started his professional life as an aeronautical engineer before moving to Qatar in 2006 to lead the risk management team engaged in the design and construction of the biggest LNG project in the world at that time. Rahat was then asked to lead and set up the ERM function in Qatargas, where he and his team have successfully embedded risk-based decision-making in all aspects of the business. Rahat has played a keen interest in developing the profession of risk management and has been associated with IRM UK for many years. He set up and chaired the very first Middle East Regional Group in 2007. With Rahat, we have Nicola Crawford, Managing Director, IRS Europe Limited. Nicola is the Managing Director of a leading risk management consultancy firm, IRS Europe Limited, and is the past chair of the Institute of Risk Management. She is also an acting Chief Risk Officer for a UK statutory body involved in financial services regulatory family. Nicola is a motivated and high-performing risk professional offering over 18 years of experience in governance, regulatory change, compliance, assurance, and enterprise risk management. And last but not the least, we have with us Mr. Sean Lutora, Enterprise Risk and Business Continuity Manager, Qatar Petrochemical Company. Sean is a Risk and Business Continuity Manager. He has 13 years of experience in Africa and Middle East in oil and gas, from engineering and design, consulting, and management. He sits on the IRM Doha Chapter Steering Committee and IRM Energy Special Interest Group. His knowledge and experience is centered on governance, strategy, enterprise risk, project risk, and business continuity management. Sean has spent the last 6 years developing and implementing ERM in different organizational contexts. So first of all, thank you very much for taking the time out and being here today. How are you guys doing?
Good, thank you.
Good, thanks.
Okay. So I'll start the conversation with Rahat. And Rahat, my first question to you is, like, first things first, how in the very first place do you get a management buy-in or management and a board buy-in for a separate enterprise risk management function when there are other functions of the organization like information security, HSE, compliance, etc., that are giving risk insight to the management for their specific areas?
That's a very good question. I think one of the aspects you just mentioned about different areas have different ways to capture risk is actually a reason for having an ERM function in the first place, and that is that you want the senior management and the board and the CEO to be able to make decisions based on a consistent set of criteria. So that's a very strong reason for having a corporate level criteria that cuts across all of the individual associations of risk and the way that risk management is done in different parts of the organization. So that's one key point. But the more important one, I think, is that establishing why. It's really important to establish why. Why should we have a risk management function? corporately? Why should we do enterprise risk management? And getting that why across is really key. There are very many reasons for that. It could be a regulatory push to start with, so we have to do it. But that doesn't get over the cultural barrier of we want to do it. So you have to get people to want to do it. And that's the big challenge. And that takes a lot of effort. I know some of your questions are going to be about cultural change, but I'll leave it for that discussion. But I think getting over the why is important. There are regulatory pushes, there are shareholder pushes, there are stakeholder pushes, but I think you have to be convinced yourself to do it and understand and appreciate the benefits, not just you as the senior management, but also the rest of the organization. So really focusing on that helps to change and evolve behaviors.
So Rahat, setting up an ERM function from scratch for a big organization like Qatar Gas, and that too at a time when ERM was a fairly new concept, must have been extremely challenging. So would you like to share with us two of the biggest challenges that you faced, and how did you manage to overcome them?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are obviously lots of challenges, but focusing on two is a tough one. But I think I've already mentioned one of them, which is around convincing people that it's a good idea. You know, you have to look upon this as a change program. It is a change to the way people do things. So there's always resistance to change. So that's a challenge to overcome, and convincing people that it's a good idea. The other aspect also is around, you know, the way we have been doing things. What's wrong with that? So as you mentioned earlier on, we have our own, you know, IT may have its own way of doing risk management, so does health and safety, so does legal. But why should we change? Why should we have another system or a corporate level system to do that? So getting people around the table and discussing why and establishing the process for how you would do it, that's a good challenge as well, because you're asking people to adopt new ways of working. How do we? I think another good challenge is how do we impart ownership? Because one of the myths that exists and still exists today is that we have risk managers, we have the ERM team, and they own all the risks. So they'll help us to identify, and they'll do it. Whereas actual fact, it's the different parts of the business that own the risk, and getting that across can be a challenge. And that takes a bit of time to establish that the ERM function is really a facilitator, an overseer, and ultimately it should be redundant because everybody's managing risk. But getting that across is a big challenge. And you know, when I look back over 10 years, I think it's, you know, we've come a long way in that. Okay. There are, as I said, there are many challenges, but I've mentioned perhaps two of them.
Thank you, Rahat. And coming to Nicola, you have consulted and helped numerous organizations from different sectors in setting up their ERM function. Although there are specific challenges to specific sectors and organizations, but what were the most common themes that you saw in all the organizations, and how do you manage them?
Yeah, okay, so just to, I suppose, expand on what Rahat's already covered. So when one of the key things is to get management commitment from the top. So starting with the board, because the rest of the organization needs to see that it's an organizational priority. Right, so along with that goes the need to make sure that everybody understands what you're actually doing, and making sure that you have the right skills. So that's the second challenge, is making sure you've got the right mix of skills within the team. You know, we always face with decisions, do we, especially if you're setting up something new, do you take someone from inside the organization that understands the organization with deep knowledge, or do you get somebody from outside that has the risk expertise? And I think this is always a challenge for most organizations, because even setting up a new function, putting in place someone internal can have politics attached to it. So I think, you know, to make sure that you get the right balance, you need a hybrid approach where you've got the deep business understanding, but somebody that can work together as a team that also has the risk management knowledge. So therefore there's a knowledge transfer, and obviously as the longer people work within the organization from a risk management perspective, they get to understand and work with the business to help them manage the risks, because we've already touched on the fact that the ownership of the risk is usually with the business, not the risk management function. Right, make it very clear that the risk management function is, as Rahat has referred to, as an overseer, provides guidance, constructive challenge. I think one of the other challenges is that making sure that your risk management operating model fits the operating model of the organization, right? So how, again, some of the decisions that you're faced with is, do you have a centralized function with quite a few people? Do you have a decentralized approach, right? But obviously there are pros and cons of each of those. My personal view is that we should have a hybrid, right? So as a risk function is there to provide guidance and advice to the business on how to manage risk, it's always quite good to have a decentralized resources in the business that you can work with. So setting up a risk champions network, in most organizations I've worked with, I've done that, and it seems to work well in terms of, one, getting the message out, but also that's also has its challenges, which I might touch upon later in another question. And I think it's also important, again, as Rahat has mentioned, that you understand why risk management is there, what's the purpose, the value, right? So the way to overcome that is to set up a terms of reference for the risk function and make sure that you share that across the organization so you get the shared value. You don't want risk management to become a, oh, quarterly update, quick, we better fill in a risk register. That's not what you want. You want it to add value to the organization and to be linked to decisions. So that's, from my perspective, those are the common themes that I often see coming through in the people that I've worked with.
Thank you, Nicola. And Sean, my question to you is, as Nicola mentioned, that there are some common themes that she has witnessed in all the organizations, and she shared it with us. What is your opinion that how different is setup of ERM function in different sectors? Should there be a standard approach, or should it be customized to organization and sector to sector?
Good question. Just to see if I can tie it up all together. If we talk about sector, the principle of risk management in all sectors is the same. Identify, or first of all, understand what your strategy is, understand where you want to go, understand or identify the risks that may affect you achieving your objective, and assist people to come up with plans on how to manage that so you can achieve your objectives. So that main thread is the same regardless of the sector or industry or size, so that doesn't change. What changes is how big your risk organization is, how much detail it goes into it. So for example, in the financial industry, you will definitely have a massive risk management arm, massive. It's a core part of their business in terms of financial risk management. Similarly, in oil and gas, in some cases, you might have a massive structure, or in some cases, a small structure. And I'm not talking about just the function itself, I'm talking about the function plus the decentralized nature that Nicola was talking about, where you have risk champions and everything else. That whole tendril structure would have to be quite significant in certain large organizations. So in different sectors, is it really different? No, I don't think it's very different. I don't think setting it up is different. What needs to be done is understand that the role of risk management purely is there to support the organization, help them in terms of the governance requirements as per many standards. There's many guidance around there. If you look at the UK side, you've got the Cadbury report of 1992 that specifies certain committees needs to be there. If you look at the UK corporate governance standards, it's also stipulates that needs to be there. There's a Tradeway Commission that's there as well that stipulates there needs to be all these subcommittees from the board. So it goes back to what Nicola said, where she said, you need to speak to the board. The board is the one that needs to have buy-in first of all. Rahat also touched on that as well. So if the board in all sectors all understand that they have, first of all, in some cases, fiduciary responsibility. Two, that they might have some liabilities if they don't manage their risk. In most cases these days, large organizations, they may be personally liable to certain consequences if risks aren't properly managed. Then you would go in and set up in the sense that you would have preferably a central function, an individual who's there to set up the risk management function and then everything else. I would really support Nicola's view that says you then want a decentralized structure where you have risk champions all over the place. And this leads into something that I think is the most important thing across all sectors: communication. A lot of our work is communication. Being able to talk, being able to pass on ideas from myself to the necessary person I'm trying to make to understand the risk or to get buy-in. So communication is another golden thread that ties through risk management function in all sectors. It's all the same. Our greatest strength is our ability to communicate and pass information to others. That's how I would sum it up if I tie all the things together.
Thank you, Sean. And coming back to you, Rahat, you mentioned a while ago about cultural issues. And I think, in my personal opinion, what I experienced was that the resistance to change was one of the biggest challenges. So cultural issues, as we talked about, are considered to be the biggest challenge that requires to be dealt with during the setup of an IRM function. What is your take on this, and how should it be dealt with?
Yeah, it's a very good point, and you're absolutely right. The cultural change is a huge issue, and it's something that doesn't happen overnight. So don't expect results, in a week or 2 weeks or even a year. For a start, it takes a while. For a big organization, it takes a while to set up the risk management function and to reach every part of the business. So if I go back to my own example of when I set it up 10 years ago, it took over a year to reach every part of the organization because we spent time with each group in each department. That's what it takes. Getting over the why issue means spending time with the business. And so setting that up initially takes a long time, in my opinion, for large organizations. So it's not just a matter of creating a policy or procedure or an email. It's more than that, as Sean mentioned. It's really about communication and awareness. And as Nicola mentioned, it starts from the top. So the tone from the top is really key to change behaviors. But then I think you've got to get the buy-in and the ownership in all parts of the business. And what everyone is concerned with when they're presented with something new is always, what's in it for me? How does it change for me? What benefit does it do to me? What does it give me? So being able to answer that question is quite key. And I think in order to answer that question, you can just go back to the definitions of risk, which the risks are associated with objectives. And everybody has objectives, whether they're departmental objectives, group objectives, personal objectives. And so if you can get into a position where you're helping people to achieve their objectives and helping them to identify those things that could stop them achieving those objectives, you're getting closer to answering the question why and getting that buy-in from people. So there are many other ways you can, affect culture. You can do that structurally. Obviously, have to have the tone at the top, have frequent awareness sessions and communication sessions, and take every opportunity to do that, not just formally in terms of quarterly reviews or half-yearly reviews, but lunchtime awareness sessions, any educational sessions to raise awareness. But you can also do this formally as well in terms of making risk part of decision making. So where do you make decisions? You make decisions during investments, during projects, during strategy sessions. And if I look back now at my own experience personalizing this, we didn't have any of that, but we do today. But it hasn't happened overnight. So we're a risk-based organization now where decisions are made on the basis of risk, and people are familiar with the language of risk. People actually talk about risk as a, they use risk terms, and when they make decisions, they use risk criteria to make decisions. So that's a good thing. However, you've got to be very careful, and this is slightly digressing with this. It has been, there has been some instances where you can overdo it. People can justify what they want to achieve by doing a risk assessment, and sometimes you have to set rules, right? So in certain situations there are these controls, in financial transactions or working in confined spaces or whatever it is. These are the rules in which you operate. These are the controls we have to mitigate this risk, and there's no discretion, there's no risk assessment in that. You have to do that, and those are things that you set in terms of boundaries. But by and large, I think setting risk-based criteria for decision making has helped to embed culture, the risk-based culture in the organization. I think the other aspect you can do is write it in people's job descriptions, at every level, from senior to right down to the business, in terms of risk and reward. The rewards you get out of managing risk well, the rewards you get out of identifying big risks. I remember a while ago when I was working with certain managers, they were actually afraid of exposing red risks. So there was a fear factor of what others would say in terms of whether I'm not doing my job right, or this is. But actually, what you want is the opposite. You want to reward people for exposing big risks, because then you can mitigate some. So these are some of the cultural issues that you find and you get over gradually. I'm sure there's a lot more to say on culture, and my colleagues will have a lot more to say on culture, but that's some of it.
Nicola, taking the conversation forward, what, in your opinion, does handling these cultural issues require a complete change management program? How do you look at it?
So, understanding, first of all, I mean, we've covered the fact, the need to understand the why, what's in it for me, the sell side of the equation. And from a change management perspective, looking at what needs to change to bring the organization along the journey. Because remember, it's a journey. It's not an end in itself. So it's important. But I mean, in terms of implementation and making that change work, I think one of the biggest mistakes and pitfalls that I tend to see are around unclear roles and responsibilities. Right, absolutely imperative that everybody understands who's supposed to be doing what. So, we talk about the blurring of the lines between what the risk function does and the business. Where I found this actually occurs mostly is when we set up a risk champions network. Because what happens is that first line managers, I haven't talked about the 3 lines of defense, but because it's a bit technical, but if we talk about the fact that risk should be managed where it's initiated or it occurs, which is usually in the front line of the business itself, management tend to then push out what they see as the risk function being the risk managers, now the risk champions being the same thing, when in fact the risk champions are there to facilitate the embedding and a bit of guidance on behalf of the risk function, while still helping to manage those risks. So I often find that the role of the risk champion becomes a little bit of a blurred role for some organizations. And it's really, really important to make sure that the role of the risk champion is clear in relation to their own management team and their own line management. Because I think one of the challenges is that if you are the risk champion in an area where you are, your line manager is also there, how does that change the nature of your reporting line? Because you're going to challenge that person maybe because of the risk, if they're not doing it in the right way or not following the company protocols, then it makes it very challenging. So it's important when setting up the risk champions network that the roles and responsibilities are very, very clear. That's my take on from a biggest tip from a change. I mean, there's plenty more, but I'm sure that they'll be weaved into the conversation as we go through the questions.
Yes, I think, Nicola, that was a very important pitfall or mistake that you mentioned, which people tend to make, or organizations tend to make when they are implementing their IRM function. Unless and until the reporting line for the risk champions is different. They're not reporting to their line managers for risk purposes, and they're reporting to the head of risk or the CRO. It will not achieve the objectives that it's supposed to be. So that was like a very important point that Nicola made. Sean, coming to you, when we're talking about like pitfalls and we're talking about mistakes, so one mistake that we often see and one question that we often see people asking is that ERM role is usually confused with that of the internal audit. So people ask that we have an internal audit function, why do we need an ERM function? So in your opinion, how important is the appropriate positioning of the ERM function within the organization, especially the clear line of distinction between internal auditor and the ERM role?
Okay, I'll just take a leaf off Nicola's. She brought it up nicely. 3 lines of defense. I know it's recently been updated with some caveats here and there, but that's all about managing the controls. However, the 3 lines of defense is a perfect example of the separation between risk and internal audit. Now, let's deal with internal audit as a separate thing. Internal audit is a manager within an organization, but cannot get involved in management activities. Okay, it has to be independent, therefore has to remain at an arm's length, at a distance from any management related activities or decisions, so that he can execute his job independently and he's not conflicted. So already there's a separation between audit and management. Risk management is intrinsic with management, because risk management is actually going to be conducted by the risk manager and management, or the owner of the risk, which is management as a whole. So if we just start on that, or delineating that aspect of saying we need to separate internal audit and audit, that's your first step. The second step is audit comes after the fact, after risk management. So risk management, as I said, is intrinsically linked to strategy. I refer to COSO in that regard, and any other standard that you may want to look at that's got to do with objectives or strategy and risk. So it's at the beginning of everything, and when you decide what could affect me to achieve my objective. As you go along the process of trying to achieve your objective, you keep trying to manage your risk. All the small things that could derail you from achieving your objective, you manage on a day-to-day basis. Audit isn't even there yet. Audit can come after the fact to see the thing that you put in place to manage the risk. Is it working, yes or no? So it's looking at your controls. So audit is always an after effect, or after the fact that we've had an objective, we've looked at our risks, we've identified controls for our risk, and we are now managing it. Then audit comes in after the fact. So they're not the same thing. They should be separated by function as well. So how should they work together? Their relationship must be really very, very good. I've seen in organizations where internal audit and risk management do not see eye to eye. There's constant clashing about controls, about is it really a risk? Is it this? Is it really effective? Massive clashes on that. The best way is if internal audit and risk management understand, first and foremost, that they're there to help the business. 2, that they're actually 2 sides of the same coin. Because when the internal auditor comes and says you need to have 1 or 2 more controls that could help you manage the risk, those controls need to be taken off by risks and embedded into their processes or into the management system that's being addressed. So I would, my personal experience, always have a good relationship with the internal manager. Try and foster a good working relationship, bouncing off ideas, having a discussion, aligning your schools of thought when it comes to your risk management work and your audit work. You'll find that the risk registers are an input or the starting point for any internal audit these days. So the internal auditor should come to you and say, hey, give me the risk register for this department or this function. Tell me where you think as a risk manager, the areas I should look at, because you're in communication with management. And you can guide him to say, don't waste your time on this. This seems fairly well managed. Kind of focus on this area because as for the risk register, this is the areas of concern, and it'll drive the discussion or his audit in the right direction. So I think that relationship really has to be paramount to have a really strong enterprise risk management system, and and also help internal audit to improve as well. That's the best way I would think it'll work together.
Yes, Sean, I think you mentioned a very important point about the relationship between internal audit and IRM function, because as you rightly said, that the risk registers and the risk profile is actually an input for the risk-based auditing that internal auditors do. So it all actually starts from the risk profile that the IRM function provides, and having that good relationship actually helps the internal audit function to perform their functions in a better way. Rahat, as we talked about management support and having a sponsor is I think, in my personal opinion, it's extremely important for establishing an IRM function. So what do you think that how effective commitment from senior leadership is secured? Because I think, in my opinion, that's a very critical thing to achieve. How do you think it can be?
Yeah, I mean, I would almost say it's essential. I've come across colleagues who cry, and justifiably a lot, that they're in these positions of managing risk, but there is no really senior level support, or it's generally a tick box, and they find it very difficult. You have to struggle to actually get people to adopt and conform. So it's quite difficult. So it's very, very important, I think, as was mentioned already earlier on, that the tone at the top is really quite key. And the way to get and you do need to have senior level involvement, and there are ways to do that, is to keep them involved in the process, make them part of the process. So for example, we have for key risks, every risk not just has a risk owner, but for example has a risk accountable authority. So you're making senior management accountable for key risks. They sign off of those risks. They report them to the CEO. Right? So you're making the chief operating officers or VPs or directors accountable for certain risks, for the big ones, and they report on them. So they're part of the process. So making them part of the process is important, but also getting their support in embedding risk is important too. So for example, you could also have, as part of every training that you do, or every awareness training that you do, is to give a little slot to one of your senior managers to come in and talk about how important it is to be, what an important training this is and how important this subject is. So it's all about giving support, but it's not just about imparting that, but it's also about reward as well. So if you've done well in terms of identifying and mitigating risks, having some kind of reward structure for that, some kind of certificate or something like that, which rewards people for good behavior, as it were, in managing risk. All of that helps to embed that culture, and I think also integrates the management leadership and the buy-in, and it helps the cultural development of the organization as well in terms of embedding risk. So yeah, very important, and very, very important, not just in terms of saying so, but actually doing so, walking the talk. I think that's the key thing.
Yes, Rahat, and I think a very important thing that you mentioned in my personal experience that I witnessed is that you need to make the senior management a part of the awareness sessions. And in fact, I think probably you should start with the senior management when it comes to awareness sessions regarding IRM, because that is how you convince them that how important it is and how it's going to help them meet the overall objectives of the organization. Coming back to you, we talked about IRM positioning and how it should be completely separate from internal auditing. When we talk about IRM positioning within an organization, and we all know that it's very critical for success. What is the best position for ERM in the organization structure so that it can play its effective role as the second line of defense, and also to make it independent from the different pressure potters in the organization?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and it's obviously an extension of both Rahat's and Sean's good insights provided so far. I mean, basically, when designing the organizational architecture, you have to make sure that, first of all, your ERM operating model fits with the governance structure of the organization. So, whereabouts does it sit in the governance structure? I mean, there's some, it's very tricky, because if you take the purest view, ERM, the second line of defense, your CRO or head of risk will usually report into a first line role, which is the CEO, right? Or the CFO typically. So those are the two reporting lines. So how do you make sure you have the independence required when the second line is reporting to the first line? I've seen this work in a number of organizations, and it basically means that you need to have what they call unfettered access to the chair of the risk and audit committee, one or both. So I've had a couple of roles actually where I've had a hard line report to the chair of the risk committee and a dotted line to the CEO for line management of responsibilities, because obviously people sitting on a risk committee are non-executive directors and shouldn't get involved in the day-to-day operations of the organization. But it is very, very tricky in terms of making sure those reporting lines are very, very clear. So go back to what I said before about the clarity of roles and responsibilities. The other thing is you need to make sure you define what you mean by independence, right? So if we take along the lines that actually the level of independence between second and third line is the relationship between audit and internal audit and risk, I would say more that the independence factor is to be objective, actually. Very interestingly, multiple organizations I've worked in or worked with, we come to do stakeholder feedback on, the time of the year where you want to get some input to the performance management process. And I often find this is a good indicator that if you have staff that are too close to the first line, i.e. their stakeholder feedback is fab, we have a good close working relationship, that to me compromises the objectivity that you can then provide when you actually try to challenge, or it blurs the challenge process. I mean, challenge doesn't have to be negative. It can be, I always believe in the word constructive challenge. So the level of independence, again, it comes back to independence versus objectivity, constructive challenge. How close should you be in terms of the working relationship? I think a positive working relationship is good, but too close is not so good. So I think this is, very important to make sure that the governance structure actually supports the level of objectivity and independence that you're trying to seek.
Thank you, Nicola. Like you mentioned, that the best way to go about it is that the head of the ERM function either reports directly to the CEO, and of course, he also reports to the risk committee. And the second way is the most commonly that I found is that the head of ERM reports to the CFO. So both the models are pretty commonly seen. Sean, coming to you, whenever we talk about risk, and people get this idea that the risk function is actually there not to facilitate, but to restrict the organization's future endeavors, and they're kind of like roadblocks. So how important do you think is to define the upside of the risk, and how challenging it is for risk professionals to talk about the value generated by risk management? Why do you think it's important, and how can risk practitioners deal with this challenge?
Super tough question. Now, it's one of those things where They, by definition, risk has always been, not by definition, but by practice and colloquial terms, risk has always had a negative connotation. The word risk is always deemed as negative. Where in actual fact there is, upside and downside risk, positive and negative opportunities and risk. Now, managing a risk in itself creates an opportunity. It creates an opportunity to either achieve your objective or to exceed it. That's one side of looking at it. There's also, on the other side, where taking a risk and managing it accordingly actually, confirms the opportunity you identified, or actually make sure that it actually happens. How to get people to understand that? That's a lot of hours talking and communicating and convincing people that this will actually help you. That's a lot of hours. It's not, you don't just have a 1 hour session with people and talk about risk and opportunity and they get it. No, it doesn't happen like that. It's years and years of talking to people, talking to the right people, the person who's got a direct personal desire to achieve something, and then you demonstrate to them and your system in a way that if we get this in place, we can guarantee you that this is the minimum that you'll get. And it takes a lot of time. So I think it's super important for people to understand that risk is not just about the negative. Oh, we manage the negative, we manage the negative. There is definitely a positive side to it, both in managing negative risk and both in managing opportunities or creating opportunities. I know this has been beaten to death. COVID is a perfect example. Those organizations that managed COVID, the risk of a global pandemic properly, or risk of business continuity, business interruption properly, clearly are reaping opportunities from being operational throughout this very challenging period. Reaping rewards. I mean, there are some businesses have been making double the profits they made before, simply because they managed a certain risk before the risk even came into place. So other organizations, not that they managed COVID, but they saw opportunities in COVID and addressed those risks, positive risks or opportunities accordingly, and put in necessary controls to ensure that they get the maximum out of the opportunity available to you. So it's literally a 180 turn of the mind. People have to think that the risk matrix is only for probability of negative things happening, or the consequence is only negative. Those consequences are also very positive as well, depending on how you look at it. So I think you have to spend the time engaging and talking, not just to the top, not just to the middle, but all the way down to the bottom, for people to understand the value of managing positive risk. When I say managing, ensuring that the positivity comes out, and managing negative risk. So conversations. I can't stress that as much. It may seem like it's the most silliest thing, going into a senior manager's office, sit down with them and have a 5-minute chat, 10 minutes chat with him about what's happening, what is he worried about the most, where does he think that he can get a little bit more, or there's an opportunity. That is a risk management conversation, and more of these conversations have to happen more and more often. Our job is not behind computers or on an Excel sheet or on the software. Far from that. Conversations with people. Yeah, that's about it.
Very good point. And COVID is the best example that those companies that were prepared and managed to deal with the pandemic in a better way. Not only did they manage it, but they found opportunities on how to perform better and make have a positive impact on the bottom lines. So before I take the conversation forward, let me please mention that our audience and participants can ask questions from our speakers and experts here, and they will be happy to answer any of your questions. Rahat, coming to you, we talked about IRM's awareness sessions, and Nicola talked about the importance of risk management, risk champions network. What is your take on importance of awareness of IRM program and training of risk champions in order to effectively implement an ERM function? How important is that, and how do you go about it?
Well, I mean, as Nicholas said, I think they're very important, especially for large organizations. And if you have a small organization, then you can probably manage. You know, the ERM team has the bandwidth to manage it. But I think for anything that's even a medium-sized to a large-sized organization, you need some level of network of champions. So really, you know, in my experience, they're absolutely important. They're an extension of what you do, what you're trying to do. They're your extended network, as it were, the people on the ground. So you do need to look after them. You do need to give them training and recognize that they have challenges. You know, it may or may not be their full-time job, right? So it's an add-on to what they do on the day job. So why should they do it? So you have to address that. Why should they do it? So there has to be some reward structure. There has to be something in it for them. You have to think carefully about the type of person that you have. Not too senior, such that they can't give attention to this role, and not too junior, such that they don't have the authority to challenge. So it's got to be a balance in terms of the people you choose. And they've got to see benefit in it. They've got to see benefit in having, you know, putting it on their CV, for example. And they've got to be rewarded for it. But they're very, very important to establish culture, to facilitate the risk process in the particular function. And I think you can do, sitting in the ERM function, you can do lots of things to enable to engage with that network. I mean, having a rolling training program is obviously, I think, very important, having that on an ongoing basis. We have a risk managers, risk coordinators conference. And so that's also a good idea to get people together there and to network with each other. So having them meeting each other regularly is important. Again, it helps in terms of identifying and mitigating cross-functional risks. You know, instead of having a siloed approach, we're talking about risks that run across functions, because you have an impact in one area and you have the mitigation in another area. So people need to talk. So having those cross-functional discussions between risk champions and risk coordinators, whatever you want to do, that helps a lot in getting those risk conversations going. We also have annual awards and spot awards for good performance. So all of that helps to create a family, as it were, of risk professionals across the organization. Ultimately, it helps the business to identify risks and mitigate them at the right place and at the right time. So very important.
So in fact, Rahat, I would like to take a lead from my experience. In my organization, the way we went about it was that the CEO asked all the departmental heads to propose people's name for risk champions whom they considered are their best performers. Then he addressed the risk champions himself, and giving them that feel-good factor that they have been chosen because their line managers and their supervisors think that they are the best in the department. So right from the beginning, you give them that feel-good factor about themselves. And obviously, when you feel good about yourself, you are more happy and more willing to perform and be part of the team. And the second thing that we did was, as you mentioned, having that added in their job responsibilities. So they that was a part of their annual appraisal. And the good thing about it is that it was the head of ERM function who appraised the risk champions for their performance throughout the year. So, and then you talked about conversations. I completely agree, like monthly or fortnightly risk champions meetup are very important, because as there can be like more than one risk that can achieve a common objective. So you need to have that conversation and giving them that comfortable feeling that they can point out any risks without the fear of being punished or penalized, I think is very important.
Yeah.
So, Nicola, when we talked about the positioning of the IRM function, the importance, but once the IRM function is established, once the basics have been laid down, it cannot run as a parallel river, and it needs to be integrated with the decision-making process and other processes. So how important do you think it is to integrate ERM with core processes, that is strategic planning and performance? What's your take on that, and how do you go about achieving that?
Yeah, so absolutely critical to make sure that risk management is not seen as an add-on. Because if it's a silo process, people will see it as an imposition. As I've mentioned previously, it becomes a tick box exercise where monthly, quarterly, people see oh, I've got to fill in a risk register. You know, it's a bit of a drain. It has no value add because it's not linked to the organisation's decision making. I mean, I think this is a common theme that's been coming through today's discussion. I mean, going back to what Sean was mentioning earlier about the upside and downside of risk as well is very important. I mean, let me actually give an example very close to home. So the Institute of Risk Management, you know, we talk about COVID. I know for, you know, way back, well, not that long ago, a few years ago when I was the chair, you know, there was a big strategy around international expansion, and I believe that that's still the case. And that was achieved through conferences, face-to-face events, training and awareness. However, along with COVID, you know, it created obviously the risk of, you know, risk appetite is actually the concept I want to sort of explain around this risk and reward analysis, because it allows you to look at both the upside and downside of risk. And so from the IRM strategy perspective, I'm sure there's no risk appetite for face-to-face events and meetings during a global pandemic. It's just not sensible and acceptable. So therefore, the need to deliver through a digital strategy, which is virtual training. And, you know, I believe that actually, as a result, the reach now globally is a lot more than if COVID hadn't happened. It's come about maybe a bit quicker than what the strategy might have originally envisaged. So you've had a downside risk, but the upside opportunity to see how that actually works. Now, if you didn't link risk management from organizational perspective, those two processes would have been completely separate and you couldn't connect the two. So it's quite important, I think, to demonstrate actually that, you know, you are using risk management to add value to the organization. I mean, obviously there are a lot of organizations that have had to go, you know, working from home, working remotely. You know, I've heard of areas where IT department had to deploy hundreds of laptops within a very short space of time. And okay, for the first couple of months, it was a little bit difficult. But since when things got stabilized during lockdown, productivity has gone through the roof. You know, there are, but what it's a little bit like those bubbles of water. You can put, you can cover one hole up, but what happens is the pressure then creates and it appears somewhere else.
Yeah.
So although we have managed the risk of working during a pandemic, there are other risks that we need to watch out for from working remotely. So, you know, obviously the safety, mental health is, you know, can come up as an issue. Basically, ergonomics at home might not be as what they are in the office. Security. So, you know, it's a little bit sort of the risk never gets eliminated. It just moves into a different type of risk. And if you don't link these things back to strategy and performance, you miss that. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think actually, you know, in the way that Rahat and Sean just described, and yourself, the performance side of it, it's very important to make sure that people are aware of, you know, the value that this can bring, and making sure that it is linked not just to individual performance metrics, but also organizational performance metrics and reporting.
I mean, just what you said, Nicola, is just unbelievable. When you spoke about again the COVID. I mean, it's a very close example, but working from home example. Manage the risk of being unavailable, close contact, you know, in person at the office. Created another risk, ergonomics, etc., but also managed another risk, completely unrelated risk. Some people didn't have work-life work-life balances. They spend far too much time far away from home. So now they got time to interface with their families and their kids and everything else. So in some cases, it's increased, employee satisfaction of their work. I know, for example, a BP just said, look, from now on, no more working in the office. Everyone work from home. We're going to go throughout all your houses. Do you have a ergonomic chair? Do you have do you have the right equipment? Do you have the correct lighting? We're going to set it up for you at home. So some organizations have gone on to say, this situation has created an opportunity for us. It's created an opportunity to say, well, bugger all, there's no need to have these people in the office. Let's cut back down our bills in terms of our infrastructure bills, our fixed costs. There's no need to pay large rentals for fancy buildings anymore. You just need meeting rooms just in case you need to come in person. Everything else can be held virtually. Universities are a good example. Courses online were very difficult to get in the last 5 years, from good universities, from reputable universities. Now you see Oxford, Yale, everyone is throwing online courses available. Again, those people who are well prepared or who saw a situation, a crisis, and decided there's an opportunity, how can we put in certain controls in place based on your appetite, like you said. We have an appetite to take risk. While we have an appetite to take risk, this is the amount of controls we need to put in to ensure we achieve that objective. So really well said. I mean, just we risk managers have to go through a constant learning and unlearning process. We may not ourselves, not just the people who we work with, but also ourselves. We also have to learn to recognize new risks all the time, to recognize new opportunities. If we are stuck in a single phase, if you only looking at one type of risk, you only have eyes for that, you kind of blinkered. So it's good that we have these sessions. It's really, really fantastic that we interact with people across different specters so that you can realize, oh, but that was an opportunity, that was a risk. So it just came off my mind.
Yes, Sean, you made an excellent point, and it probably wouldn't have been possible for us to have you, Rahat, and Nicola for a seminar in Pakistan, within a few days of planning it. So that's one of the, positive outcomes of the change. Sean, as a risk professional, how important do you think it is to take things step by step? Because from my personal experience, I have learned that the one mistake that you as a risk practitioner should not make is not to overwhelm people with risk language, the difficult risk language, talking about Monte Carlo simulations and difficult terms that people don't understand. How important it is to take things step by step, and you need to set the basics right first and then keep it simple and then take it from there, rather than establishing a risk management software and having all these difficult conversations.
Right. And you're very right, Sohab. The 4 people on this panel right now is a perfect example. We've had a good 45 minutes of a chat, and all of us have actively avoided using any unnecessary jargon. We've avoided using big words. I mean, the biggest thing that came up here, I think, was that might require going into more detail was appetite, risk appetite. That's about it. But typically, such things are avoided intentionally simply because speaking in the simplest of terms to people makes people relate to simple ideas. Using simple examples makes people relate to, or understand simple ideas. So it's super, super important. Avoid the jargon. That's for, academic conferences, or, theoretical conferences, etc. When you want to impress your friends or whatever. In the workplace, really, what you have to do is break down really complex situations or complex concepts into the simplest language that people can understand. The context in which I understand something is very different to the context that Rahat understands something. One, we're from different backgrounds. Two, there's cultural differences. Three, what he's seen in his life is very different from what I've seen in my life. So you have to break down things into the simplest, basic structures possible. You want to drive or take a flight to New York. Okay, if a tsunami happens in China, is it going to affect your flight to New York? Therefore, a tsunami in China is not a risk to you. You know, simple examples. If you go into detail, if you go into too much complexity, you lose people. And once you lose people, that's it. Same thing. You have to. It's like I don't want to say it's like talking to an infant. I don't want to say that, but you really have to take baby steps. The organizations that were successful, and I'll go back to the pandemic now, in convincing their senior management early last year by simple conversation. If this happens, this could happen. If this happens, this could happen. Yes, it might have a low probability, or it might not happen anytime soon, but if it does happen, we have to move very quickly. People who manage to convince their senior management with simple language are the people who've got the senior management hooked to risk management, whose management defers to the risk manager to say, hey, what do you think about this? So I think it's, basics. Stick to basics. Once you got the basics behind the scenes in your black box, and we used to call it your black bag of tricks, then you can do your Monte Carlos, then you can do your all your quantitative analysis. You can do that in your office in the background and come up with the result. The result you bring out must be simple. Complexity creates more uncertainty. I love Monte Carlo, love it to bits. For project risk, love it. For financial risk, love it. But rubbish in is equal to rubbish out. So if you do the same simulation 3-4 times, you're going to get different results because you'll change probabilities, you'll do certain things, you'll change assumptions. Always keep it simple. Keep the complex stuff to yourself, to your peers, to check you, to have a peer review, to have someone who understands it better or the same as you. But when you're speaking to everyone else, keep it simple. That's my advice. Simple conversations will get you the best results in risk management.
Thank you, Sean. I think you made some really good points over here. And with that, my questions have ended here, but we have some questions from the audience, and anybody who wants to answer the question can do so. So one question that we've got is that someone has asked that what is more, and I think Nicola touched upon this a little bit before, what is more important for a risk practitioner? Is it the knowledge of the business in the sector that the company operates in, or is it the technical competencies which are on a range of risk management issues which is more important? So basically, if I sum it up in simple words, if an organization has 2 candidates for its head of IRM, one an internal candidate with years of experience of the industry, the organization, and a little bit of knowledge of IRM, versus somebody who is from the outside, doesn't have the knowledge of the industry and the company, but is very good at IRM skills. So what is more important? Nicola, would you like to answer the question, as you have touched upon it a bit earlier?
Yep. I mean, I would say a balanced approach, but if I had to choose one or the other, I would say that because it is the role of the risk function to partner with the business, right, then I would take the risk management skills. Because at the end of the day, partnering with the business is you know risk, they know the business, and together you create the success required.
Okay,
that's my view.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I would look for evidence that, as Sean mentioned earlier on, the risk concept is applied to all businesses in all sectors. It's the same process. And I would look for, I would agree with Nicola, but I would add to that, yeah, if I was pushed for a choice, firstly, balanced approach is the one. If you've got somebody with both the experience, sectoral experience, and the risk experience, there's nothing better than that. But if you had to push for make a decision between the risk and then I would go for the risk experience, but I would look for evidence of application in different areas. So I think, you know, if somebody has demonstrated that they're able to work within a risk function and they've applied it to different settings, then that gives you some added comfort that, you know, they're able to come and adapt and apply the same principles to a whole different area. So.
And adding to that, I think another thing which is very important is the people skills, because you need somebody who needs to lead a change and who needs to have conversations from with the entire organization. So I think people skills is also something which is very important in addition to business skills and risk management skills.
I would really, sorry, Sean, before I just want to emphasize that point. I think one of the key skills of a risk practitioner is facilitation. And facilitation at all levels. You know, you've got to be able to stand up in a workshop setting, either one-to-one or in a workshop setting, have people from different backgrounds, different seniority, and be able to talk and to be able to facilitate the discussion and help them to arrive at decisions. That's actually quite a key part of risk practitioners' work. So communication is very important. Absolutely.
Very true. Yes, Rahat hit the nail on the head there. That ability to be able to change from one-on-one conversations with board members, being able to convince them, stand your ground where you have to, and also listen on their side, and go all the way down to the lowest person on the organization and be able to explain basic concepts to them. That is fundamentally important. Think about it this way. Risk management has always been seen with negative. Okay, people have, I think in the last 2 years, to be conservative, people are now more open to talk about risk. And I say 2 years, I really don't think people still are. Historically, people don't want to talk about risks, historically, because talking about risks means that I am now exposing myself. I am now telling management that I'm not doing my job or that I can't do my job. So that ability to communicate and be able to get information that otherwise would not be freely given by people is super, super important. Because remember, you're then going to the most senior level of the organization and going to tell people, hey, we have a problem and we need to fix it, and this is how they plan to fix it. And there are going to be some tough, discussions around there. So that ability to communicate, interpersonal skills, being able to modulate conversations, being able to steer the conversation in the right direction is absolutely fundamental. I would pick someone who's got the risk management qualifications and who's a good communicator, because you can teach them about the business, and they only need to be able to ask the right question from the people who've got intrinsic knowledge to the business. So that's what I would do.
Thanks, Sean. Another question that we have here is that how do you make sure that risk language is embedded in an organization at all levels?
I think I'll go for this. Risk language. So every organization has got its own risk language. Let's start from there. Or not risk language. Every organization has got its own language. Okay. How do organizations normally create language? It's part of their culture. Documentation. Start off an IRM manual, a procedure. Call it a manual, a procedure, a framework, whichever way you want. That framework should have the language which you deem appropriate for your organization. Now, where can you get the guidance for this? I can list a whole range of documents that can guide you to set up a risk management framework. But once it's set up in the framework, it's now up to you to educate, contact training sessions, awareness sessions to the rest of the organization, from senior management to everyone else. What you find is once management starts using certain words, or senior management, or the CEO starts using certain words, everyone else starts following through. So getting your sponsor at the right level, be it the CEO, be it the CFO, whichever chief executive is the sponsor for risk or on the risk committee, to drive using the right language, right terminology, is absolutely fundamental to get that right. But again, avoid using complex things. Keep things as very simple as possible. In our organization, we avoid using things like appetite and tolerance because people typically here in the Middle East don't use appetite and tolerance. It's interchanged. So we shy away from using appetite and tolerance. I would use it in the back of my office behind closed doors or in a meeting with the executive, but in a public setting, I would not necessarily use the word appetite or tolerance, because one person may have one understanding, even though it's written in a framework somewhere and he should know it. So language is part of culture, which takes time to build.
Thank you, Sean. And talking about risk appetite, our next question is also.
Bob, can I answer? Can I point something out? Can I
Sure.
add to what Sean has said? Because I think language. Agree with everything Sean says about having a language, having a common language is very important. We've also got to recognize, though, that in different specialisms, there are specific languages, the specific language in terms of risk. So, for example, IT have a specific language in terms of risk. They measure risks in terms of availability and data integrity, and so there are standards, specific standards, sector standards for managing risk, and so that you can't stop them from having those conversations, and obviously having that performing that in that way. Similarly, if you go to health and safety and projects, they have certain professional standards that they follow, according to their sector. So you can't stop them having that, but what you can do is make equivalents, and at the corporate level say, when you talk about this is what it means. And by the way, here's an additional set of language this is what we all agree with as the common language. But here are a set of terms which have the same meaning, but are used in different parts of the organization. So making it clear what that language is, I think, is important. Not stopping people from continuing to perform their roles within their specific discipline, professional discipline. I think is also a balanced approach. I think is what's needed. That's all I wanted to say.
100%.
Sorry, go ahead.
100%. We have that debate right now with HSE, aspect and impact. So on the HSE risk registers, they love to use aspect and impact, which is basically saying risk cause, and risk consequence. Same thing. Mitigation and control. There's so many things that people interchange, but like you said, if you can tie that golden thread between equivalence words that mean the same thing that are used in different settings, it helps the organization to go forward. The one thing that I know unifies the organization, which we've tried to do, it's extremely hard to do, is to have one base document from which everything else can stem from. And that document is the risk matrix, the integrated risk matrix. As long as you can use whichever words you want and find your way back to the risk matrix and use and plot the risks accordingly, everyone has got some understanding. So there has to be some golden thread, some reference point for something. And it's extremely difficult to do, because for smaller organizations, it's simple. For large organizations, it's quite hard to get everyone speaking the same language when it comes just to the matrix. That's the only part I try and get people to speak the same language on, just the matrix. Everything else.
Call it risk appetite. Sean, call it risk appetite.
No, don't say risk appetite. That's in my organization.
And I think I just mentioned something over here just to add on to the conversation. Is I think the role of risk champions is also very important when they have their departmental sessions. That is one way of embedding the risk language in the organization, is that if they talk about the risk language and not the difficult language, but the common language, not to overwhelm them. So I think departmental meetups of risk champions is also a way to go about it. So I'll quickly take one last question, because we don't want to the overtime. Setting risk appetite is considered one of the most key elements of an ERM function. So however, there has always been a debate whether risk appetite for key risk categories should be defined before you have the visibility to the risk profile, or should it be defined after completing one cycle? How do you comment on both options from personal experience?
I can take the first part of that.
Good.
The risk appetite discussion needs to happen whenever you're having a discussion about strategy. Where that sits in when you're setting up your processes depends, but to me, I'm not going to define risk appetite, but it's really the key around what sort of risks do you want to take, which risks do you want to accept. Obviously, within banking, people lend money to make money. So this is credit risk is the risk that they want to take. The operational risk around how they do that properly actually is the risk that they want to try to minimize, because it can actually have an impact on that profit margin that the credit risk is creating. All right, so it's really, it's conversations around, risk acceptance or how much control you want to put in place. You can use terminology other than risk appetite, but it is usually first iteration should happen at the strategy type discussion at that level. And then obviously, once that starts to get embedded, you may then have to come back and review depending on how that is working in practice for the organization. So it's not a strict sort of rule, but it needs to be linked to the strategy discussion, I think, is the point I'm trying to make.
Thanks. Rahat, one last question, and that is that where a board with non-executive directors is part of the governance structure for risk management, what should be the level of training of the board in terms of governance, management, operational, and processes so that they can meet the requirements?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. You mentioned non-executive directors as well.
Yes, it is a bit unclear, but basically, I think what our participant is trying to ask is that where you have a board with non-executive directors, they may not have the right knowledge and skills regarding risk management and to effectively carry out their functions. What level of training do they require?
Yeah, I think the board should have a consistent level of training. And when you're appointing non-executive directors, or when you've appointed non-executive directors, I think that's the role of the board to make sure that they are properly trained and inducted into the process of governance. And so there is a minimum requirement, I think, even for a non-executive director in terms of the kind of competencies that he or she should employ. And one of those should be a sort of basic knowledge of, or more than a basic knowledge of risk, of making risk-based decisions. So that's that I think is quite important. But you raise an interesting point about how much knowledge should the board have, and what role does the ERM play in terms of educating the board. And I think sometimes you're up against that, right, in many instances, and sometimes you have to do that education, in that direction as well. So I think it is important as a general principle that the board has good basic knowledge of making risk-based decisions. Absolutely, including the non-executive directors.
Rahul, would you like to, talking about training, would you like to talk about the trainings offered by IRM in this respect?
Yeah. So have you got a couple of slides on that? I think many of the everything that we've talked about today, there is training that's offered by the Institute of Risk Management. So as you mentioned earlier on, I sit on the board of Institute of Risk Management. So training is a key element of what the IRM delivers. And nowadays there's just so many virtual trainings delivered by the ERM. Some of these are a couple of hours, but some could be over a number of days and weeks. And there's also training that you can take over 6 months or or so to achieve certificates. So let me look at, if you go to the following slide, you can see the type of training that's offered today in terms of virtual courses. So we've touched upon a lot of these today. Embedding risk management, risk championships, risk champions, risk appetite and tolerance, third party and supply chain risk culture, risk reporting, risk in the boardroom. So a lot of what we discussed today is offered in terms of virtual courses by the IRM. And I'd invite anybody listening to go to the IRM website, which is shown there on the top right, and have a look to see whether there's anything there that could interest them. So thanks for that opportunity to tell people about the courses at IRM.
If you look at in the virtual courses, it says risk in the boardroom. Just to answer your question directly, so up there, and you'll find that it's actually a requirement, and I stand corrected, but I believe it's a requirement for most boards to be inducted, board members to be inducted. So they have to have a induction of all the the organization and the main board subcommittee. So if you have a risk committee that has board members on it, or the risk board subcommittee, as a risk manager, I would encourage you to create a induction pack for the guys who sit on that, and for the board as well, and explain to them, because they must have implicit understanding of what the risk capacity of the organization is. They have to have an understanding of what the maximum limit they can take when it comes to risk, and therein your risk appetite, which is always slightly below your risk capacity. So things like that are fundamentally important to have. A small 5, 6, 7 slide pack. That's way too much for board members, but a very short, brief introduction to risk management, what they need to understand, what decisions they need to make, when they can make decisions, for what kind of risks. You don't want to bring in small departmental risks to the board meetings. That's a waste of their time. You want to bring real material risks that can impact the business based on the output of your risk assessment. So yeah, super important.
Thanks a lot, Sean. Thank you, Rahat. Thank you, Nicola. Really grateful and really appreciate your time. And I think we had an interesting conversation. We tried to talk about the challenges that are usually faced in the establishment of an enterprise risk function. And I think the common themes that were highlighted was like management commitment and need to make sure that you have the right skill set in the organization, answering the question, the why question, and making people have the ownership of the process are some of the challenges that are faced by risk practitioners who are trying to establish an IRM function. We also talked about how to overcome these challenges, and one thing that everybody agreed on is that it's a cultural change. It's a change management process. It's something which does not happen overnight. It's a journey. And during the process of this journey, one thing that we talked about was to avoid the common pitfalls and mistakes that people often make, making it too complex, making people overwhelmed by the process. So what basically risk practitioners need to do is make the people feel that they are facilitators, they are there to help them achieve their objectives rather than being a showstopper. I hope that all of you found this conversation interesting, and many of your questions were answered in today's webinar. Once again, thank you all very much, and ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, take care of yourself and stay safe. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.